Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to the video. Today we're got a big brain topic. This is a Final Fantasy XIV, efficiency or creativity. It's a very interesting discussion talking about should we be more efficient or should we be looking to more creative activities in Final Fantasy XIV. And, I had my thoughts about this and we discussed this on our live stream at twitch.tv/Bwana. We stream almost daily. Come on by. We're about 3 p.m. Eastern, we're live. Sometimes we're a little bit late. So come on by, check us out over on Twitch. We're live all the time. Also, if you like this video, please comment, like, subscribe. I appreciate all your feedback. Thank you so much for being so awesome. And if you're a patron, thank you for supporting me. Patreon.com/Bwana if you want to support me. Check out the video. All right, this next video is kind of big brained. It's called Final Fantasy Changes, Efficiency or Creativity. So I need you to focus because it's a very good and interesting topic. Let's watch it.
Good day, everyone. I am the Snowdy Scribe, and today I would like to take a moment to address what I see to be a lot of mixed comments on the changes to the dungeons, or rather, the earlier dungeons within ARR.
2.0.
Now, anyone that's been playing Final Fantasy XIV for a long time, or since the beginning, will know that the earlier dungeons in ARR were vastly different from what we're used to seeing nowadays. The earlier dungeons in 2.0 were a lot more expansive, with other nooks and crannies that could be explored for either bonus loot or experience from mobs. This, of course,
Is he talking about, is it the Total Rock changes he's talking about?
Encouraged players to be a bit more explorative. But as
because Total Rock had a lot of the backtracking and stuff in it.
Fantasy XIV got more and more popular and more streamlined, that sense of exploration slowly started to disappear as more and more players were subscribed to the wall-to-wall methods that we're used to seeing nowadays.
Yeah, wall-to-wall is linear. It's like pin to pin. I think I said that term in another video that I did. Pin to pin. You go from, if you're the tank, you go to one pin, then you go to the next pin, and you go to the next pin. There's no side areas or secret rooms or anything like that.
Honestly, this transition of dungeon design kind of happened as earlier as Heavensward, so we can't say this happened all of a sudden.
True.
After all, designing fewer nooks and crannies in a dungeon means being able to make dungeons faster for the game overall.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are asking, why did they go back and change the earlier dungeons in the first place?
Because y'all cried. I remember that. Everybody was crying that they took too long. Especially, I'm thinking about Total Rock. That's the one we had to get like the little green glowy things from different... People were complaining that it took too long. Especially if you didn't know where you were going. And after you get through 2.0 and you're in 3.0 and 4.0, when you're doing old dungeons, it's just for roulettes. So you just want to get them done as fast as possible. So everybody's shifted. Everything shifted from getting through the content initially to, I got to speed run roulettes. These are my dailies. I want to get through it as fast as possible. And Final Fantasy XIV is a game that, as touted, rightfully so, as a game that respects your time.
And there's actually more than one answer to that question. One answer is so that the dungeons and fights there within were more balanced and formulaic with their current system. Another answer is because Final Fantasy XIV has gotten a boom in popularity, and they wanted the older dungeons to be more accessible to newer players.
Okay, maybe.
And the last answer would simply be because people were complaining about them.
Yes, exactly. That. I'm gonna go with number C. We're gonna go with number C. People were complaining. They were loud too.
That might sound odd to a lot of people, but there were a vocal amount of people that were complaining about the design of the earlier dungeons, how they weren't as fast as other dungeons, or more appropriately, not as efficient. And ultimately, efficiency is the reason the earlier dungeons were changed. Sure, the new dungeon formats are not as creative as they used to be in early ARR, but they're more efficient for people that are trying to go in, get the clears, and finish as soon as possible.
Well, I got a little segue because the earlier dungeons, I feel like the 2.0 dungeons were trying their best to create a bridge between 1.0 and 2.0. So they use a lot of assets from 1.0. Mainly just to save dev resources and time, I think. They couldn't develop these things from scratch because they had such a short time frame to go from 1.0 to 2.0, to go from that abysmal launch of 1.0 to that period between 1.0 and 2.0 where they were developing two MMOs at the same time. I think a lot of it was just we need to reuse as much as we can. And I don't think it was necessarily trying to steer towards creativity, but more along the lines of we need to bridge the gap on where we want to go with 2.0 and where we want to go with 3.0 and beyond whatever where we're going to go. We need to bridge what we had before. And I think that's what we got as a result. We got this hodgepodge of semi-explorable dungeons, and some of them were like a little bit weird and some of them weren't. Because 1.0 was very, very much... I mean, just look at the Black Shroud in 1.0. Just look at the zones in 1.0. They were mazes. 1.0 was all about exploration. It took the Final Fantasy XI idea of you just go out and explore and do stuff. It took that idea and it tried to bring it to Final Fantasy XIV. And there was a lot of exploration and I don't know, getting lost and getting one-shot by mobs, you know. That was the thing in 11. I think they tried to bring some of that. That wasn't a thing in 11, but that was a thing. That was one of the things in 11. And some of that still exists in 14. If you go to the Black Shroud, you can still see some of that stuff, right? You can still see some of the weird tile sets that they had that they copy and pasted in 1.0. So I think it was more of a bridging between that mindset and where they wanted to go. And I think 2.0 has a lot of the mixtures between the two.
Final Fantasy XIV has done a great job at trying to not only respect the time of its players, but appeal to the group of people that simply want to go in and complete content as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Roulettes.
But as we're seeing with this change to the earlier dungeons, there is another group of people that are not happy with this direction. And I wanted to try and take today to explain why. Usually, there are two different kinds of people that play video games like this. The creative players are going to pick their favorite job, weapon, avenue, or dungeon, regardless of what everyone says. These people usually aren't too bothered by what we would call the meta. They're going to pick their favorite job, and they're going to run it through all the content they possibly can, regardless of what people say is the best job. These people usually don't mind spending a few extra minutes in a dungeon if it means being able to explore more and see more. And second, you have the people that I lovingly dub the meta chasers. These are players that are going to go out of their way to try and find out the best options, choices, armor, weapons, whatever in any video game to make the experience as quick, seamless, and efficient as possible.
Well, I don't know if this would apply to Final Fantasy XIV dungeons, and I'll tell you why. Final Fantasy XIV dungeons, the first time you go through, right? I can agree with what he's saying, that there's the people that want to explore and figure out and read all the lore and stuff like that. I think the issue is that when you repeat it, when you repeat the dungeon, like if I got to go through and I got to do Brave Flocks for my daily, I'm doing leveling dungeon, I got to do Brave Flocks. And I'm already in Shadowbringers. I'm in level 70 something, about to hit level 80. And I got to do Brave Flocks. That mindset of I'm going to go through and explore and I'm going to use my favorite weapon, that you're not thinking that anymore about Brave Flocks. You're thinking, I need to just get through this because I'm doing this for tombstones. I'm doing this for a roulette. So I just need to get through this. That mindset is gone. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're being efficient, that you're trying to be super efficient, that you're trying to follow the meta. It's just that it's no longer a priority. You've already explored it. So it's old content. I don't think that really applies to a majority of the player base. Where you say that, you know, you've got creativity versus meta when it comes to repeating old stuff. I don't think it applies that much, because I consider myself to be a person that doesn't care what the meta is. I play what I want to play. Like, I picked up Warrior when Warrior was terrible. I thought Warrior was terrible, and I loved it. I loved the class. I loved how it played, but I didn't care what the meta was. I'm the person that likes to do dungeons without a guide. I like to go in blind. I like to go into raids blind. I like to do all that stuff blind. I like to discover it, right? But that only lasts for so long. Like, if I'm going back and I'm doing it for reason A, reason B, reason C, to get something, because that's the primary motivator behind doing old content in Final Fantasy XIV. The game gives you incentives to do old content, and it rewards you with something that you need for later content, like poetics. Poetics can be useful for a lot of different things, and different types of tonestones can be used for a lot of different things. So you're doing the old content to get progression in a newer system. So the importance is on the newer systems and the newer content, not necessarily on Brayflox, not necessarily on Armvale, right? At that point, it makes sense to think efficiently, even though that's not how you normally play games. It just makes sense that, hey, I need to do this as fast as possible so I can get to something I really want to do. Like, I want to go and do this content over here. I want to do some treasure hunts, or I want to go explore this. I want to go fishing over here and see, you know, I want to go do this other stuff for the first time, or maybe the second time. I don't know. So I think it's a really weird hodgepodge mishmash of repeatable stuff versus new stuff. And when you get repeatable stuff, efficiency rears its head. When you gotta repeat something, especially like the Moogle events is a perfect example. When the Moogle events come out, what happens? People try to find the quickest, efficient way to go in with a blue mage and grind out them tombstones, right? That is the efficient crowd right there, the blue mage group, right? But I can't really say that I know anybody that will go through and just pick a dungeon and like somebody that has interest in the Moogle tomes, right? They have interest in the Moogle tomes and just do Armvale 10 times just because. I don't know very many people like that, right? Or people that will just do Praetorium 20 times to get the maximum amount of tomes. Or people that just will just do PvP to get the tomes. That are just doing it for creative purposes. I think that's an important distinction to make. Are they doing it for creative purposes, or are they doing it to get Moogle tomes? There's only so much creativity you can do if you're trying to get tomes. It's a chore so that you can get a reward. And I think it's a good system. I'm not saying it's a bad system, because it encourages older players to play old content so that when new players come in, they got people to play with. You know, it's something that World of Warcraft kind of envies in Final Fantasy XIV. Old content is still made relevant through this. So it helps the game overall. At least that's my take on it.
And normally, there's nothing wrong with either of these ways of playing. I'm a huge advocate of people playing games how they want to. The problem arises when you see someone who wants to take their time, explore a dungeon, see all the sights, and they get paired up with someone that wants to run the material as quickly as possible.
That would be a sprout versus a veteran almost every time. Like, I can't really see a situation where those two styles of play are both veterans. I can't see it. It may happen, but I can't see it.
Now, the efficient player is more or less dragging the person who isn't as efficient as them through material, kicking and screaming, and these people usually don't see eye to eye because their idea of a fun video game experience greatly differs from the other. How does that affect Final Fantasy XIV?
That person that was exploring that dungeon that you just talked about in that scenario, fast forward a year from now, they're not going to feel the same way about that dungeon. They're going to be willing to speed run through it almost every time. Like, I can't think of anybody that does that. Now, let me just clarify that. they'll be willing to wait for sprouts to watch cutscenes. They'll be willing to go explore again, but that's probably not going to be their preference after they've repeated it for the 20th time.
Ultimately, the answer to this question is rather simple. It's all about the game's community. Yoshi P and his team, and by extension, their game Final Fantasy XIV, is a good example of creativity and efficiency at war with each other. This battle goes all the way back to the early days of 2.0. Did you know that in the early days of ARR, you could actually pick stat points and allocate them in whatever way you wanted?
Yeah, I do remember that. And everybody did the same thing. Like literally everybody did the same thing. There was no variation at all. And it was actually a fault of the game because it wasn't made relevant at all to the point to where we told people to not care about it. Like it was like, if you, cause you can roll any job, right? And it didn't make sense with the game systems to get a Rogadin and focus all your points on mind if you're going to eventually level up and your Rogadin may not be a healer. He may decide to go, as a Lancer. And it just didn't make sense to even care about that. And it was just, it made no sense. It was a bad implementation. And the result of the bad implementation is that everybody did the same thing, which in the end didn't matter, which is why they got rid of it, because it just didn't matter.
Sure, there weren't tons of stat points. I think there was only 30 in total, if memory serves. But you could choose where you wanted them to be. Strength, dexterity, vitality, intelligence, etc. This allowed players a bit of creative choice, something that many people would rejoice at seeing.
There was no creative choice because it ultimately didn't. It was an illusion of choice, is what it was. There was no real choice there. It was an illusion because ultimately, due to the game's multi-class system, that one character can play every class, really made that ineffective.
But that function was removed entirely. But why?
Because it didn't work.
The answer is because of the community.
No, I disagree. It wasn't the community. It was not the community. It just didn't work. It failed. It just didn't work.
Optimal point allocation. If you were a physical DPS, then you were told by the community to invest all your points into strength.
And then you changed jobs.
If you were a tank, you were told you should invest most of your points into vitality.
And then you changed jobs.
Intelligence for black mage, mind for healers, and so on and so forth. Creative choice in Final Fantasy XIV was discouraged by the 14 community at a very, very early age.
Because it didn't make sense. It wasn't about efficiency versus creativity. It was that the game systems clashed. It was a clash of systems because because stat point allocations in RPGs are put in place so that you can customize your character to fit what you need to do. And in most cases, if not all cases, that's because that character is only going to do those things, in the majority of games, only going to do those things and nothing else, unless the game has a reroll function. That's how RPGs got around the whole idea of, changing focuses, is that you would reroll. And when reroll was introduced, guess what? You really didn't care what you picked because you could change it at any time. So it wasn't a meaningful choice. Games that have stat allocation that you can't change offer a meaningful choice. That's my opinion on it. If you can't change it, it's a meaningful choice. Reroll, if you can reroll, it just doesn't matter. Pick anything you want, especially if the reroll is free.
It got so bad that it started to create what we call gatekeeping, or groups of players that will absolutely refuse to take other people through content if they don't immediately match their recommendation.
Okay, I see where he's going with this point. I don't agree with the segue. I don't agree with the bridge. Using stat point allocations to make that point, I don't agree with. But there were gatekeepers for other things. I wouldn't use stat point allocations, though.
Let's say there was a tank that invested a few points into vitality, but invested the rest of the points into dexterity to try and increase their parry rate. Because in their mind, more chance to parry means less damage taken. That might not be a bad idea on paper, but the community ultimately decided that that wasn't the ideal or meta method of allocating your stats.
Was it the community or was it the min-maxers? Here's the thing, though. Min-maxers are a very vocal minority. You gotta get that out there. Min-maxers are a very loud minority. There's, even back in 2.0, there weren't a lot of people like that. They just weren't. And today there isn't either. Mainly because Final Fantasy kind of discourages it, you know, with a lot of the normalization that happened. Because, you know, min-maxers does that, the whole idea of min-maxing does create gatekeeping. And it does create kind of an area or a environment that can breed toxicity. It doesn't cause it, but it kind of gives you a fertile bed for toxicity. If you've got a lot of room for min-maxing, especially as you get up into Savage and Ultimate stuff, right? What we can do now is mainly just meld. You know, we meld and we maximize our rotations. That's pretty much it. And to me, that's good because that's not a whole lot that people have to master to min-max in this game. So once you maximize your rotation, once you maximize your meld for your playstyle, then it just becomes a matter of learning mechanics and maximizing and doing that, which to me is fun. That's the definition of fun for me. All that activity I just named is fun. But yeah, well.
So anyone who did allocate their stat points like that were shunned or told to change their point allocation before they would be allowed into raid.
I didn't see that at all, but I didn't see the whole game.
This gatekeeping and optimal point allocation got so bad that everyone was essentially running the same point distribution.
See, I don't know. I was running this out. Everybody was running the same thing because it didn't matter. That's that.
So ultimately, can you blame Yoshi P and his team for removing the function in the first place? If no one was going to be creative with their point allocation, why even include it? And ultimately, we had the same problem with materia in Heavensward. Tanks were told to put nothing but strength materia on their
okay, this is a better example.
Accessories. And if you weren't doing that to maximize DPS,
I remember
many
this.
tanks were shunned.
I do remember tanks being shunned for not doing what he's... Yeah, that is a very fresh memory. Heavensward with materia, especially with Alexander. Oh my gosh, Alexander created a world of hurt in Final Fantasy XIV.
So, what did the director and his team do? Strength materia and all stat bumping materia such as that are gone now. When everyone is doing the same thing over and over and over again, there's no reason for them to waste time or money on creative outlets that no one's going to use.
I don't know if I agree with this conclusion. It's kind of I'm not seeing, it's kind of a stretch. I'm not seeing the connection between the examples and the points he's given and the conclusion he's reaching. I'm not seeing it.
And ultimately, this loops all the way back around to 14's take on dungeon design nowadays. Why would they bother making a dungeon with multiple paths if most players are only going to pick the most linear and efficient way to run the dungeon?
You can blame that on roulettes. Honestly, this is a byproduct. If roulettes did not exist, we wouldn't be having this discussion about optimizing dungeons. Because nobody would be doing them. Nobody would be going back and doing Brave Flocks. Unless somebody in their guild / free company would say, hey, I need some help. Nobody's queuing for this dungeon. I need somebody to run this old dungeon for me. Which sounds like World of Warcraft, right? Nobody would run it. So since we have roulettes, which forces you to go do old content, and the only reason you're doing roulettes is so you can get tomes, let's be real, it's not so you can explore a dungeon. You are rolling the dice randomly. If you want to go specifically go explore something, you would go to that dungeon, right? Roulettes just throw you in something and they give you a reward for your reward is for helping new players. So that's why there's this seemingly clash, because veterans are trying to get through it as fast as possible and sprouts are experiencing it for the first time. So roulette is the reason why you have this disparage mindset. I don't think it has to do with efficiency versus creativity. It's a chosen game design by the Final Fantasy XIV developers to have roulettes.
What's the point of
And it's a
creating
byproduct
more
of it.
monsters to fight if they're just going to be avoided in the first place? And if you haven't noticed, there are many players that openly discourage people from not pulling wall to wall. If the tank isn't pulling wall to wall, usually
We just had a video talking about this.
they're yelled at by the DPS and healer. So, as you can see, the Final Fantasy XIV community is choosing efficiency over creativity.
I guarantee you 102% of those people that are complaining about not pulling wall to wall, they got to that dungeon via roulette. Guaranteed. They got there from a roulette. They are there to get tomes. I don't think it has to do with creativity versus efficiency. It's because it's the reason why they're there. The reason why the Sprout's there versus the reason why the Veteran's there. The Veteran's there to get tomes. The Sprout's there to experience content for the first time. That's the problem right there.
Year after year after year, the 14 development team has been shown time and again that their community is going to pick the faster, safest, and most efficient way of clearing content over anything else.
Okay. I keep bringing up roulettes, but there is a small exception to that. People that only raid. I'll talk about that. People that only want to do extremes or only want to raid, they will blow through the story. They will blow through the dungeon content and not care about what anybody is saying. They just want to get to the raids. And that's I really believe that's a minority. That's a very small percentage of players. So small that I don't even think it's worth mentioning in terms of like the effect it has on the entire player base. Because those people are logging in the first day. They're logging in the day the patch comes out and they're blowing through it on that day. Right? And if they got to repeat something, they want to do it as fast as possible. But the people that they're doing it with have the same mindset. So there's no disagreement. There's really no disagreement. Yeah.
It's the entire reason that most holiday events are so short now. We had many players complaining that the seasonal events were too long.
It's my first time hearing that.
That they didn't want to spend 10 to 30 minutes talking to NPCs about Christmas when they'd rather just end it in 5 minutes and go back to doing whatever else it was they were doing.
I've never heard this complaint, but I don't have my ear to the ground to every complaint, though. So this is the first I'm hearing of this.
So whenever I hear people ask why there isn't more job customization or ability customization within Final Fantasy XIV, my answer to their question is always simple. Because you're not going to use it.
What? Say that again?
Customization or ability. Whenever I hear people ask why there isn't more job customization or ability customization within Final Fantasy XIV, my answer to their question is always simple. Because you're not going to use it.
Well, yes, I will. Yes, I will.
Or rather, the community will not allow you to.
If it's a badly designed system, like we talked about with the point allocation on a character where you can change jobs at any time, yeah, I'm not going to use it. But if there's job customization to where if there's a talent tree, for example, yeah, I'm gonna use that, even if it's not the most efficient. I mean, I play ARPGs. That's all we do is we explore builds. And we have fun with them, even if they're not the most efficient. That's ARPGs in a nutshell. Okay, well, I think that's the way he feels about it, but I don't think that's the way I feel about it. And I can't speak for everybody else, but oh, heck yes, I would use it, especially if it was well designed. Now, if it was badly designed, a badly designed job customization system usually ends up like that. Look at Diablo 3. Diablo 3 to me had a badly designed job customization, and what happened? Everybody used the same 1 or 2 builds for everything. It wasn't properly designed. And you can't blame the players for that, because ARPGs, and I know I'm kind of crossing genres here, but ARPGs, they really are about efficiency. But players like me like to experiment while being efficient. Look at Path of Exile. It's a perfect example of that. Path of Exile is a game where your experimentation and creativity will give you possibly more efficiency. So the creativity comes in finding ways to be more efficient. You get the best of both worlds.
They will tell you which abilities to pick. They will tell you which points to put your materia into. Yoshi P and his team have created an MMO that they are proud to say has an open and cooperative community, but that's by design. The fewer customization options they give you as far as pathing in dungeons, stats for your job, or abilities means that there's fewer and fewer things for people who only pick the most efficient or meta options to complain about.
So let me dive into this point a little bit more. The motivation, this is what I believe, the motivation for duty support, this is the new dungeon system where you're going in with NPCs, is so that players doing dungeons for the first time can go at their own pace, they can explore, they can take in the sights, they can read, they can interact, and they can become more in tune and more attached to the characters. And I heard that the duty support party use the same people throughout the entire time. So you actually grow with them, right? People who do roulettes are going to be a separate group of people than people doing duty sports. I think that's why they did that. This is all stemming from roulettes, because roulettes are about efficiency. That's just how they work. And the problem comes along when you've got people doing roulettes and people doing the story for the first time in the same group. Two different mindsets trying to do a dungeon. That's why one person wants to rush, one person doesn't want to. Duty supports is for those people who want to take their time through the content and not have to worry about somebody else rushing to get their tombstones. It's a band-aid for roulettes. That's what duty supports are. Roulettes has a bad side effect. It has a byproduct. This is the roulettes have a lot of good things, right? It keeps us playing old content with new players. It keeps all the old content relevant. But a byproduct of roulettes is that you're going to have clashing players going in for different reasons. And duty supports is a band-aid for that. People who want to go through the dungeons, the story mode dungeons, because those are the most important ones, right? For a lot of players. People who want to go through the story mode dungeons and they want to take their time. They now have an option to do that without having to be clashing with players that are in there for their tombstones.
They're trying to keep things simple for new players. They're trying to give the people that are quick to anger very little to no wiggle room. And ultimately, this makes Final Fantasy XIV an incredibly accessible MMO. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that takes a lot of time and money to create. So they're ultimately not going to waste time on features that they know players are going to either ignore or fail to take creative advantage of. These new changes mean that the players that would always drop out of Castrum Meridianum have no real reason to anymore, because the time to run both Castrum and Praetorium are about the same now, with the...
Can you do duty support with Castrum and those things? I don't know. Yeah. You don't even have to... Right now, due to these changes, you do not have to interact with the player in any of the dungeons where duty support is supported. You can do the entire story with AI. You can do the entire story with AI. So his point that he's making about, I don't agree with this point, because duty supports are put in place so that players don't even have to encounter players. So if they run across somebody in roulettes, they won't have a problem, right? Everybody, this puts roulettes mindsets in the same group, and it puts people who are doing the story for the first time in the same group, right? So I think this is a little bit of a stretch, because at the end of the day, Yoshi P and crew, they want their player base to have a pleasant experience, no matter what they do. Right? So rather than rely on roulettes to give new players someone to do the dungeons with, they scrapped that. They essentially scrapped that, right? And they said, okay, we can't rely on roulettes for that anymore. Let's just do trusts. Let's do duty supports. Trust 2.0. Let's do duty supports. If new players, especially if you're leveling a DPS, you don't have to worry about queues anymore. You don't have to worry about other players. You don't have to worry about somebody dragging you through a dungeon, because you can do it with AI. That way everybody's happy. And that's Yoshi P's mantra. Make everybody happy somehow. I don't know how he does it, but make everybody happy.
About the same experience buff from the main scenario queue. It's the simple things like this that the 14 team are trying to iron out and make a more reliable experience for their players, both old and new. And they can't really do that if people are dropping out of instances just because it's not efficient.
People were dropping out of Castrum, I think after the XP change, right? I think that's when it happened. And the reason why they're doing Castrum, I feel like I'm a broken record now, is because of roulettes. They went to roulettes to get they didn't go specifically choose Castrum, man. That's why they're dropping out. They wanted Praetorium, but they wanted the roulette bonus.
Now, mind you, I didn't make this video to start a war between the players that want to take their time and customize against the players that want to run content as quickly as possible against one another. The entire reason I made this video was to kind of bring light to the state of the 14 community, why they made these changes, and why we're probably not going to see explorative or customizing options in the near future. Final Fantasy XIV might not be the game that has perk trees or stat allocation or little nooks and crannies to explore, but that's because the players don't want those things.
I disagree. The players do want it. The game pushes you. The game literally pushes you to do roulettes. If you want a very efficient and fun way, I admit it's fun. Roulettes are fun to me. Efficient and fun way to earn gear. Roulettes. That's how you earn gear, is roulettes, right? And repeatable dungeons, that's in-game. A majority of the player base, I think right now, is an in-game. So that's what we're going to do. We're literally pushed towards that. And what you're saying is players don't want to explore. No. We do want to explore. I think we really do want to explore, but the game tells us to do roulettes. That's what we're told to do by the game. If you want this thing, you're going to need tombstones. How do I get tombstones, Bwana? You do daily roulettes. If that wasn't in the equation, we wouldn't be having this talk right now. Seriously, if you got rewarded, like in a Guild Wars 2 way. No, Guild Wars 2, you just go out and you just go out and you explore, and then you do the dynamic quests, and then when almost like Fates, right? You do dynamic quests and you get rewarded for that. If that was the case, people would just go out and do people would just go out and do stuff if they got good rewards from it. It's a carrot and a stick issue. You've got to get players in the in-game portion of this for veterans. You've got to give them a reward that not only honors their time, but makes doing fun content worth it. Because even if something gives a good reward and it takes too long, people are going to be like, I don't know if I want to do that. Right? And I think that's why people don't like the playstyle of Guild Wars 2 is because they don't really like to explore. And that game really rewards exploring. Like really, Guild Wars 2 really rewards exploring. But that doesn't mean that players, all Final Fantasy players or a majority of Final Fantasy players are like that. It's just that we now have, there's a lot of people that just don't like roulettes. They like, I don't even want to do roulettes. They're like, I'll just get it some other way, or I just won't get it. I don't know, man. This video makes a lot of great points. It's a great discussion. But I think it points to me, it highlights for me a side effect and a repercussion of designing the game the way it's designed. Roulettes were put in place mainly, if I'm correct here, they were put in place so that new players won't be sitting in queue all day. Long story short, they just won't be sitting in queue all day. Newer players can get a decent queue because old players are constantly going to be recycling old content. And World of Warcraft, they're trying to fix that problem right now. And Final Fantasy XIV has fixed it. But a byproduct of that is that you're going to have clashing parties. You're going to have people that are in there for efficiency and people are doing it for the first time. Honestly, there's no way to avoid it except if you separate them. And that's exactly what Final Fantasy XIV did. They separated the groups. Now duty support people can just do it, get the story done, not have to worry about people that have social anxiety or don't want to be in dungeons. And then you got the people who are grinding through roulettes to just go through the roulettes and they can do their thing, right? Kind of making the roulette system lose its value big time, which makes me think that it might be going away. You heard it here first. Roulettes might be going away. Because honestly, duty supports make roulettes unnecessary. If they can get like duty supports working for optional dungeons and for other stuff like that, you really don't need roulettes anymore. You honestly don't need them. You might need them for PvP, but you really don't need them. Because the newer player base, if they can't find anybody to play with, they can play with AI. That's the way I feel about it.
Yoshi P and his team has evidence, years of evidence that suggests that no one wants to be creative or explorative. They want to run content as quickly as possible. So instead of pointing fingers at other people you may or may not play with, I want you to ask yourself, what do you think is more important? The player's creative choice to build their character however they see fit, regardless of the meta or how it might gatekeep them against other players? Or is the current system more important? Something that evens the playing field out so finely that while you might not have any real choice, the options you do have cannot be denied.
Okay, let me clarify something because I see some chatter in the chat about some stuff. What we're talking about is those instances, we're talking about the cases where you've got a player who wants to get to the dungeon as fast as possible, and then you've got a sprout that doesn't want to do that, that wants to explore. Right? This is the use case that we're talking about. Specifically that. What my point is that roulettes have made that possible. And it creates a lot of strife in the community because we had a discussion about this the other day about a healer pulling through it, basically forcing a tank or like pulling the entire dungeon for a tank. And we talked about this the other day. And that's a case of that, where that healer wanted to go through the dungeon fast and the tank wanted to learn how to play the game. He wanted to go slower for whatever reason, right? He was new or whatever. And they clashed. So roulettes put those two players together. It's a matchmaking system that put those two players of differing mindsets together. Right? It doesn't happen all the time. What I just described doesn't happen all the time. It may not even happen the majority of the time. A majority of my roulettes don't happen like that. Thankfully, the Final Fantasy XIV community is courteous enough to, we have the sprouts. So if we see a sprout, we kind of assume things. It's an unwritten rule in the Final Fantasy XIV community. What this video is focusing on and what I'm talking about is when people ignore sprouts. When they go, oh, it's a sprout, I don't care, I'm going to run through this fast because I want to get my tomes. Roulettes are the cause for that. That's the problem. That's roulette's fault for that. So while you guys may not feel that way, and while other people may not feel that way, it does happen. The regularity of how often it happens, I don't know. But I do know roulettes make it possible. So making old content relevant is, to me, one of the primary goals of roulettes. That's why you have leveling. That's why you have 50, 60, 70, 80 dungeons. That's why you have expert. Expert is there so that, I think expert is generally where you find a lot of the end game, because people are just grinding the top tier tomes or grinding material right now. And that's why you got main scenario. That's why guild leaves are still there. Who still does guild leaves? I don't. the guild leaves is still in the roulette, so that we can help newer players. If it weren't for roulettes, they would never get a queue. Because there's really, honestly, there isn't a lot of reason for veteran players to go back and do Heavensward dungeons unless they want to just do it for nostalgia, or they want to farm a set or something like that. That's what WoW is going through right now. There's no reason to go back and do old stuff unless you need a MOG, right? Isn't that how WoW works? You WoW players? That's the only reason you go back and do old content, is because you want an old MOG if it's still there, old transmog. Our reason for doing old content is that the roulette throws us in there. If we're in Armvale, there's a low chance that we want to go there. If we're in Brayflox, there's probably, if we're at Kugani Castle, we're jamming to the tunes. We're like, hey, I remember this dungeon. We didn't know that was going to get picked. The roulette threw us there. And then you got somebody in there that's in there for the first time, and you go through the joy and maybe the agony of teaching them the dungeon, whatever it may be. And these are not invalid experiences. Roulettes are not terrible. It's just a byproduct of them is you're going to have these spats, which honestly I think are the exception. I think that's going to be my conclusion to this, is that roulettes are, I mean, not roulettes, but I think this scenario of somebody wanting to rush and somebody not wanting to rush is the exception. I don't think it's the rule. I want to go back and hear his question again, because I didn't really pay attention to it because I was thinking.
Who you think is more important? So instead of pointing fingers at other people you may or may not play with, I want you to ask yourself, what do you think is more important? The player's creative choice to build their character however they see fit, regardless of the meta or how it might gatekeep them against other players? Or is the current system more important? Something that evens the playing field out so finely that while you might not have any real choice, the options you do have cannot be denied.
I think this is making a really poor assumption that efficiency is not creative. I think that's kind of a condescending point, because the fun, if you will, for a lot of people is the efficiency. The creativity comes in finding the fastest path. The creativity comes in determining the best way to do it and figuring it out in the fastest way possible. Right? Not necessarily exploring and trying to find your way of doing it, but trying to find the fastest way possible. That's a form of creativity that's actually kind of rare. And it takes talent for people to do that. But the thing is with that mindset, is that once you've found the fastest way possible, you move on to something else. It's no longer fun once you've found it. And I think that's also true for the flip side. Once you've explored an area, you're going to move on to another one. You know, once you've explored a dungeon completely from soup to nuts and you've documented everything, you've read every document, you've looked at every orifice, you're going to move on to another dungeon. So they're very similar ways of being creative. And in both of those cases, the players are doing what they want to do. There is no right way to play the video game. That's my answer to his question. Is it A or B? No, there is no A or B. What Yoshi P and crew have to do is make sure that these two sets of players can play together in a system designed to where they can do what they want to do and not clash and butt heads too much. Right? And not cater to one and not the other. That's what makes Final Fantasy XIV so great to me, is because they do a great job of catering to the hardcore and the casual at the same time, which is like juggling cats. It really is juggling cats. Somehow they're able to do it. With extremes and ultimates and with savage rating, they're catering to the hardcore, right? With materia, with crafting, with the whole crafting system and the gathering system, they're catering to some of the hardest of hardcore players, while at the same time giving the casual players a lot to do and quick ways to stay relevant, like somewhat close to the hardcore. Like the gap isn't that big. Like I could just grind tomes and have decent gear to do content. But the content is just hard enough to where if you min-max, it's kind of rewarding. It's juggling cats. It's really difficult to do. Somehow they're doing it. I don't know how, but they're doing it.
It's an opinion that can go either way. I, for one, love Final Fantasy XIV, and while I think it could stand to have some more creative choice, I do understand why it's not implemented. Maybe one day, if the player base as a majority decides that they want to be more creative versus efficient, then
he keeps blaming, and I think this is what's bothering me. He keeps blaming the player base because the player base is crying for efficiency. And my rebuttal all this time, you guys have heard it for 1,000 times, is that we didn't want this. We didn't necessarily want this. It's just roulettes just push you to efficiency. Dailies push you to efficiency, right? If you've got a daily timer on something and you come home from work and you've got 3 hours, maybe 2 hours to do what you got to do, you're probably going to find an efficient way of doing it. Not everybody, but most people. I'm not going to queue as a DPS if I got something to do in an hour. Or if I got to help something with my family or my wife or my children or something, if I got to do something a little bit later, I'm not going to queue as a DPS. I'm going to queue as a healer or a tank. Faster queue. Efficiency. Not necessarily a bad thing, but that's how roulettes are designed. So we've got to blame the game designers here a little bit. We can't put all the onus on the players like this video is suggesting, is that if the player base wants creativity. No. When we got roulettes hitting us upside the head and you have to do roulettes, we can't just say, why don't y'all want creativity? Because roulettes are telling me that I need to do this every day. And the faster I do it, the quicker I'll get my gear. Right? It's not Guild Wars 2 where we can just go out and do whatever and the game just throws rewards at you. It's not like I even think about Lost Ark. Lost Ark rewards exploration. If you just go out in Lost Ark and just do stuff, there's so much stuff out there that you're gonna get rewarded with something useful. Final Fantasy XIV is not designed that way. So while we seemingly don't want creativity, as this video suggests, the game doesn't lend itself to give it to us. Sadly. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. I mean, it's not a bad thing.
Then we may see a steady return of options. But until then, we've yet to do anything to prove Yoshi P and his team otherwise. But that's enough me picking your brain for a day. I will catch you all later, and I hope you all have an amazing week. Stay safe, my friends.
That's a great video, man. That's a great video. It sparked a really good discussion. Something I really haven't thought about in a long time, but like, can we really say that roulettes are going to be around by 7.0, 8.0? Because he's, Yoshipi's talking about doing a long time. If everything's going to have duty supports, why do we need roulettes? Like from an overall game design standpoint, right? Obviously we need them for tomestones now, but I still believe that roulettes were put in place so that new players can have someone to play with. If we got duty supports everywhere, they've got somebody to play with. So do we still need roulettes? Right? Do we still need roulettes? Because we could just have a dungeon finder. I'm not talking about duty finder overall. I'm talking about just the roulettes page where it has those list of things. Like if I wanted to just queue and find people to play Brave Flocks, I don't think that's ever going away. That's Dungeon Finder, right? Dungeon Finder's not going away. But those roulettes where we get bonus materials for helping new players, do we really need that anymore? Duty support takes too long. If someone thinks that duty supports take too long, they don't want to be playing with AI. They want to be playing with players. Like that, I think that's a good point. That person is thinking efficiently, They want to play with players. And what they should do, if they got to do a dungeon for story, right? They queue up for that dungeon and they're going to be with players. And if you're talking about timings, that's because you're doing dailies. You only care about time because it's a daily. If it wasn't a daily, if you're doing it for fun or you're doing it for a story, then the time won't really matter that much unless you just really, really, I got to finish the 2.0 story before Friday or something, right? And then in that case, you would seek out players. But to what this video was talking about with efficiency or creativity and just players clashing with, I want to explore the dungeon versus I want to speed through it. If it's taking too long, you obviously want to speed through it. Yeah, as long as we have tomes, I think they'll keep roulettes. But you can get tomes. Tomes are given out just about a lot of activities, not just roulettes, right? Like we get tomes, like for example, Crystalline Conflict. We get poetics through that. That's not even roulette. That's just going straight into Crystalline Conflict, doing ranked. You get tomes. Going into a raid and somebody hasn't done it, you get bonus tomes because that person hasn't done it. Tomes can be spread just about everywhere. They can crank up the tomes and fates. They can crank up the tomes in PvP. They can put tomes anywhere. Like we don't have to have roulettes for tomes. And I think that would be an interesting experiment. I mean, that's like a whole nother video, honestly. It's like, can we just like get rid of roulettes and just put tomes everywhere else in the game? In places where are interesting? Or create new areas? Have like a dungeon of the week? I don't know. Go the Mythic Plus route. Have a super hard dungeon, like get a dungeon and do something really creative with a hard dungeon and just give you bonus tomes for doing a hard dungeon. You can just throw out ideas like this and just, have a good discussion. Anyway, that's like a whole nother video. This is a great discussion, even though I didn't agree with a lot of the, I'll put the link in the show description, by the way. Even though I didn't agree with a lot of the glue to his points, I think we didn't see eye to eye on the cause. He thinks in this video that the community is the cause. I think roulettes are the cause. So I think that's where we disagree. I think we both think that the game can be improved, and I think a lot of his points were valid. But I just don't blame the community for this happening. I blame roulettes. That's just how I think. All right. Leave your description. Leave your comment down below. I'll put the link in the description. Leave your comment. What do you think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I crazy? Is this guy right? Is he wrong? Is he crazy? Let me know. I'll see you all next time. Have a great day. Goodbye.